Fresno, California. One September afternoon, 2023. Some cities look perfectly ordinary from a distance. Neat little streets, a high blue sky, the faint sound of kids playing ball in the fading light. But deep down, every city has its shadows. Stories people don't talk about, or only whisper to each other when no one else can hear. Fresno is no exception. That day, Rebecca Scott was driving slowly down a quiet back street on the north side of town. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time the way she always did, drifting from one estate sale to another, sifting through forgotten things. When she spotted the crooked estate sale sign by the curb, she hit the brakes almost without thinking. A weathered one-story house, dead grass, peeling paint. She squinted at it for a moment, then shrugged. Why not? It was only after she'd stepped through that doorway that Rebecca began to understand. There are places where you don't need to be told anything to feel the chill they carry. And buried in the dust of that house, she found an old Polaroid camera. And a sealed film cartridge, faint words scrawled across the tape. Do not develop. That night, Rebecca pressed the shutter. Just once. That night, the air in Fresno felt heavier than usual. A brief rain earlier in the afternoon had already dried, leaving behind the faint smell of damp asphalt and dust seeping through the window of Rebecca Scott's small apartment. She sat alone at her kitchen table, a single yellow lamp casting its glow down on what she'd brought home from the old house. The Polaroid camera lay still in front of her, as if waiting. There was something strange about it, familiar yet unsettling. Her hands were still dusty from the sale, but the metal body of the camera felt cool and solid. When she pressed the shutter button, it let out a soft little click. The film cartridge was still sealed, the yellowed tape stretched across it, faint words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Do not develop. Rebecca sipped her now cold tea, her eyes fixed on the cartridge. She had never been the superstitious type. Over the years, she'd brought home all sorts of odd things from estate sales. Clocks that didn't keep time, cracked mirrors, even a rusted music box that played a tune nobody could name. This was just another oddity. That's what she told herself. And yet, her fingers hovered over the tape longer than she'd expected. Finally, Rebecca drew in a breath and peeled it away. The dry, brittle sound of the adhesive lifting filled the quiet kitchen. The cartridge slid neatly into place with a gentle click. The Polaroid gave a faint hum as the fresh batteries kicked in, like something stirring after a long sleep. She set the camera back down, adjusting her lamp for better light. For a long moment, Rebecca just sat there, staring at it, wondering if the film could possibly still work after all these years, or if this was just someone's idea of a cruel little prank. Then, almost without thinking, she raised the camera, aimed it at the wall opposite her kitchen, just plain beige paint, the faint outline of a picture frame that had never been rehung, and pressed the shutter. The mechanical whir startled her slightly. The Polaroid whirred and spat out a curling white square. Rebecca laid it down on the table and waited. At first it stayed blank. Then faint shadows began to bloom under the surface, gray shapes resolving into lines, into light and dark. It wasn't her wall. It wasn't her kitchen. It was a dining room. A mid-century wooden table, 4 full-place settings, roast chicken, green beans, buttered rolls, half-full glasses of water. Above it, a ceiling fan just visible in the top of the frame, its light casting long, uneven shadows. She blinked, felt a chill ripple through her. Without a second thought, she pressed the shutter again. Another whir, another square of film. This time, a hallway. Yellowed wallpaper. Family portraits lined along one wall. And then the third. She pressed the button, laid the photo down, and stared. The same dining room, but now the chairs were overturned. The ceiling light cracked and leaning. The plates gone. And in the doorway leading outside, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, a small shadow. A child, barefoot, turned away. Rebecca sank back into her chair, her heart thudding. It wasn't just the eeriness of the photos, or even that they were decades old. It was something else. Something about them felt deliberate, Like she wasn't just looking at someone's memories. Like she was looking at something no one was ever meant to find. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the camera over, inspecting every detail. The worn strap, the scuffed edges of the lens. And there, faint but legible, on the underside of the strap, was a small label. Graham, 462 Sycamore Street. Rebecca murmured the name to herself. Graham, Sycamore. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a faint memory stirred. A podcast she'd half listened to late one night while editing photos. A story about a family in Fresno. Disappeared. Never found. And now, here was their house. Their camera. Rebecca sat frozen, staring at the last photo as it finished developing on her kitchen table. The shadow of the child in the doorway seemed to darken by the second, as though it was holding something back, waiting for her to look closer. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, her mind replaying the 3 Polaroids laid out neatly on her kitchen table. Dinner, perfectly set, untouched. The faded hallway, and the small child in the doorway, a shadow even darker than the light could reach. But more than what the photographs showed, it was the feeling they carried that unsettled her. The sense she was peeking into a secret no one else had dared to open. By dawn, with the first faint light seeping through her blinds, she got up. Sitting back down at the table, she carefully photographed each Polaroid and loaded the images onto her laptop. Then she typed in the only phrase that had stuck with her since the night before. Graham family disappearance, Fresno, 1971. Within seconds, results appeared. One old article from a long-defunct local paper. The headline was stark. Graham family vanishes from home. Mystery unsolved. Rebecca read every word. On September 17, 1971, Edward Graham, a power plant employee, along with his wife Mary and their 2 young children, Emily and Jacob, were reported missing after Mary's sister stopped by their home at 462 Sycamore, as she often did. The house was undisturbed. Lights still on. Dinner on the table. Their car still in the driveway. No sign of a struggle. No note. No witnesses seeing the family leave. Police launched an extensive search. Dogs, helicopters, even self-proclaimed psychics. Every theory was floated, from cult abduction to carbon monoxide poisoning. But in the end, nothing. The case went cold. The story faded. The house passed through bank foreclosure, then renters, then abandonment. To this day, the file remains open. Rebecca sat still, her hand gripping the table's edge. Her eyes drifted to the 3rd photo again. The shadow of the child, standing in the doorway, still seemed to bleed darker into the paper. She drew in a deep breath and picked up the Polaroid camera again. Slowly, she removed the cartridge, turning it over to study it under the lamp. There, near the edge of the old tape, she caught something. A faint impression, as though someone had once scrawled a note and the ink had nearly faded away. She angled her flashlight, squinting, and finally read it. Last scene, kitchen. Her throat went dry. She set the camera down and reached for her notebook. Only one thought circled her mind now. If these photos really were taken the night the Grahams disappeared, then who had taken them? And why hide them away for more than 50 years? Rebecca wrote one line, heavy and deliberate, across the top of the page. 462 Sycamore. Go back. The next morning, Fresno lay under a thin veil of mist, as late autumn days often do. Rebecca sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the faded number 462 painted on the mailbox post. The Graham house. She'd driven here early, following the address on the camera's worn strap. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, even from this distance, the house made her uneasy. It looked even older and sadder than she'd imagined the night before. A crooked for sale sign hung on the chain-link fence. Weeds choked the yard. Dust clung to every window frame. Rebecca rolled down the window, took a deep breath. No voices, not even a dog barking. Just the sound of wind hissing through dry hedges. Finally, she opened the door and stepped out. The porch creaked under her weight. The front window glass was so clouded it was impossible to see through. Rebecca tried the doorknob. Locked. She backed away, scanning the sides of the house. On the left was a rusty gate hanging loose. With a gentle push, it opened. Around back, the yard was overgrown, an old swing set leaning to one side. The sliding door into the kitchen was blocked by a sheet of plywood, nailed hastily in place. She circled quietly, her eyes darting to each window. At the kitchen window, Rebecca crouched and pressed gently. The metal frame groaned. The window slid open just enough for her to squeeze through. Her heart raced as she drew a breath, then slipped inside. It was cold in there. Strangely so. The air felt heavy, faintly musty and stale. The kitchen looked exactly like the photograph she'd taken the night before, except now it was empty. No table, no chairs, no food. But Rebecca still recognized it. The crooked ceiling fixture, the dead ceiling fan above, and near the doorway to the backyard, a faint smudge on the tile floor, right where the child had stood in the picture. She stepped slowly, every footfall creaking against the wood beneath her. Rebecca stopped at the hallway. The walls were lined with faint rectangular outlines where family photos had once hung, now just pale patches in the faded wallpaper. She pressed her hand to the wall. The paper crumbled slightly under her fingers, flaking away to expose dull plaster underneath. She peeked into the next room, a small bedroom. The pale pink paint was peeling, cartoon animal stickers still clinging crookedly to the closet door. This must have been Emily Graham's room. She slowly turned back to the hallway and froze in front of a mirror mounted on the wall. It was large, framed in black painted wood, clouded with dust. She wiped a circle clear with her sleeve, revealing her own reflection. But in that moment, she felt like something else was staring back at her from behind the glass. She reached out and touched it lightly, cold as ice. A thought flickered through her mind. There's something behind this mirror. Rebecca pulled her hand back, took out her phone, and snapped a quick photo. When the screen lit up, for just an instant, something dark seemed to flash in the corner of the mirror. She gasped, spinning around. But the hallway was empty. A chill ran up her spine. Swallowing hard, she retreated toward the kitchen, pulling her notebook from her pocket. With a shaky hand, she scrawled a new line. Behind the mirror? She glanced back at it one last time, her eyes tracing the dark edges of the frame as if it really was watching her. Then she quietly climbed back out through the kitchen window, sliding it shut behind her. Outside, the wind had picked up. As Rebecca climbed over the fence, she turned for one last look, and froze. The sheer curtain at the front window shifted. She stood still. The curtain moved again, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a small hand pressed lightly against the glass, then gone as soon as she blinked. Her chest tightened. She hurried to her car, started the engine, and drove off, never once daring to check her rearview mirror. Rebecca didn't drive straight home after leaving 462 Sycamore. Instead, she stopped at a small cafe on Shaw Avenue, settling into a quiet corner. Her coffee went cold in her hands as she opened the folder of photos she'd just taken inside the Graham house. She zoomed in on the mirror, adjusted the brightness and contrast. And then, faintly, she saw it. A shadowy outline in the dusted glass, as though someone was standing there, silently watching from behind. A chill ran down her back. She knew now she wasn't imagining anything. For years, the name Graham had just been another cold case on Fresno's long list of unanswered mysteries. But now, seeing what lurked behind that glass, she was sure it had never truly been closed, and no one had ever really wanted to look closer. She opened her laptop and pulled up the old articles she'd downloaded the night before. One name stood out. Thomas Bell, the Grahams' former neighbor. In the records, he was the only one who ever claimed to have seen a strange man lurking near the back of the house the night the family disappeared. Rebecca found a phone number listed in a public directory and, hand trembling slightly, dialed. Thomas Bell, now in his 60s, didn't sound surprised when she explained why she was calling. He was quiet for a long time, then finally agreed to meet, telling her to come to a small house on the outskirts of town later that evening. His house sat at the end of a narrow lane, its porch overgrown with dead vines. He was waiting on the steps, tall but slightly stooped, his eyes dark and wary. Thomas recognized the Polaroid camera the moment she showed it to him. His hands shook as he touched it, as if the little object carried a piece of memory he'd spent decades trying to bury. In a low, hoarse voice, he recounted the night. He had been just a boy then, living next door. He'd heard a sound in the Grahams' backyard, thought it was just stray cats at first, and crept outside to look. And then he saw him. A tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes, walking slowly along the back wall. At first he thought it was Edward Graham. But when the man turned around, he knew he was wrong. There was something in the way he moved, deliberate but off, that told Thomas, even as a child, this was not someone who belonged in that house. He'd told the police everything, described what he'd seen, but his account was never recorded. They'd just patted his head and told him he had an overactive imagination. Rebecca sat in silence, listening to every word. Then she pulled out the 3 photos she'd taken, laying them carefully on the table. When Thomas's eyes fell on the last one, the child at the threshold, the black shadow looming behind, he let out a breath and lowered his head, his hand clenching tight. That shadow, he said, he could never forget. The house had never really been empty. That night, back in her apartment, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She opened the mirror photo again, this time enlarging it further, fine-tuning the light. And then, clearly now, there it was, a faint, blurred face pressed against the glass from the other side. A cold thought slipped through her mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. Who from the beginning had really been watching whom? The next morning, Fresno was blanketed in a dull gray haze. Rebecca woke from a restless night, the photo of the mirror still open on her laptop screen. That blurred face seemed to cling to her, watching. She decided to go back to the Graham house, this time better prepared. She packed a small flashlight, thin gloves, her notebook, and spare batteries into her bag. Standing once again before the rusty gate, her heart pounded. The kitchen window was still ajar, as if waiting. She slipped through, stepping back into the cold, still air of the house. It felt different now, heavier somehow, with the faint sour smell of damp and dust hanging thicker than before. Every footstep creaked loud against the wooden floorboards, echoing in the silence. She made her way straight to the hallway where the mirror still hung, dust covering its surface. This time she didn't rush. Running her hand carefully along the wooden frame, she pressed gently at each edge. One corner gave just slightly, almost imperceptibly. Rebecca froze, drew in a deep breath, then pushed harder. A sharp click broke the silence as the frame shifted outward, revealing a narrow black gap behind it. After a moment's hesitation, she pulled on her gloves, removed the wooden panel fully, and was met with a gust of stale, cold air, thick with dust. Behind the mirror was a cramped, dark crawlspace, no more than 3 feet tall, running between the walls. Rebecca climbed in. The space was tight enough that she had to hunch and crawl on her knees, her shoulders brushing the rough beams and cracked plaster. The flashlight beam swept over warped boards, sagging wires, rusty nails. The smell was worse in here, dust mixed with something metallic and faintly organic. About 6 meters in, the narrow passage opened into a small alcove. Rebecca raised her head. Her flashlight caught on an old folding cot covered with a filthy, threadbare blanket. Next to it sat an overturned crate holding scraps of stale bread, a broken matchbox, and a tattered comic book. She crouched, sweeping her light across the floor. Then she saw it, a Polaroid, lying face down in the dust. Rebecca picked it up, turned it over under the beam. The image showed a young girl, unmistakably Emily Graham, crying, her small hands tied in front of her. The background was a dark, unfamiliar corner, unlike any room she'd seen in the house. Her throat went dry. She flipped the photo over, scrawled on the back in faint, smeared blue ink. "She still cries, but not for long." She dropped her hand, her chest tightening. The crawlspace fell completely silent, except for the sound of her own breathing. And then, she heard it. A second breath. Not hers, slow. Uneven, close. Rebecca froze, holding her light forward, her pulse hammering. The beam landed on nothing but cracked beams and dust. But the sound remained. She backed away, crouching lower, scrambling as fast as she could. Her shoulder clipped a sharp corner, tearing her glove. At last, she wriggled back out through the gap, slammed the panel closed, and leaned against the wall, gasping. From behind the wood, she heard something scratch, softly, deliberately, against the panel. Not frantic, not violent, just enough to let her know it was still there. She didn't look back. She ran straight to the kitchen, climbed out through the window, vaulted the fence, and locked herself in her car. Sitting there, hands still trembling on the wheel, she stared back at the dark, silent Graham house. For the first time, Rebecca felt afraid, not of the house, but of whatever was waiting for her, inside those walls. The next day, Rebecca didn't return to the Graham house right away. She spent the morning in her apartment, staring at the photo of Emily found in the crawlspace. The words scribbled on the back, "She still cries, but not for long," echoed in her mind every time she closed her eyes. There was no longer any doubt. Someone had taken that photo after the Graham family vanished, and it had never been turned in, never investigated. Rebecca decided she had to go back. This time she called Thomas Bell. He didn't ask many questions. His voice was flat, resigned. "I'll meet you there," he said. Later that afternoon, they met again outside the Graham house. Thomas brought a heavy-duty flashlight and a small pry bar under his arm. He stood silently, staring at the kitchen window as Rebecca opened it. Inside, the house felt even colder than before. The air was thicker, the smell of damp stronger. Rebecca led Thomas straight to the mirror in the hallway. She showed him the hidden seam. He nodded once, murmuring, "You were right." Without hesitation, Thomas crawled in first. Rebecca followed. This time, they pressed deeper into the walls than she had dared to go alone. Their flashlights swept over rough beams and shadows that stretched long along the passage. At the very end of the narrow space, Thomas slowed, crouching low to examine something. It was a crooked wooden wall, nailed clumsily in place, the rusty heads of the nails glinting in the light. He spoke quietly. "Help me." Together they pulled. The board came free with a dry crack, releasing a thick cloud of dust that made them both cough. Behind it was a small hollow, just big enough to crouch inside. Neatly stacked inside were old wooden boxes, labeled by hand in faded ink. October 1971, classroom. January 1972, girl in blue. April 1974, mirror. September 1979, the watcher. Rebecca felt her stomach turn. She knelt and opened one. Inside, row after row of undeveloped Polaroid film cartridges, each one still sealed, their labels written in the same shaky blue ink. Thomas said nothing, his flashlight beam shaking slightly in his grip. Rebecca opened another box. This one was filled with developed Polaroids, their edges curling, the images yellowed with age. Each one showed women, girls, not just the Grahams. Some were younger than Emily, some older. All of them posed on chairs, their hands bound, eyes wide and vacant. She flipped one over. On the back, a faint line read, "June 1973, learning to smile." The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. This was no isolated tragedy. This was a system. Someone had photographed every moment of every child, building a 6 collection. Rebecca held her breath, snapping pictures of every label, every photograph. Then Thomas crouched lower, pointing to a corner of the hollow. His voice dropped to a murmur. "You see it?" Rebecca followed his light. There was another small compartment, a loose panel barely covering it. She carefully slid it out. Inside was a small cassette tape, the label written in the same hand. Interview. Beth learns the mirror game. Rebecca looked over at Thomas. His face was dark, heavy, and she felt it now, in her bones. What she was touching here wasn't just evidence. It was the archive of someone who had turned the Graham house into his own private laboratory of horror. And he had kept at it for years after the night the Grahams disappeared. That night, Rebecca didn't go home. Instead, she and Thomas returned to his old apartment, a converted space above what used to be his family's garage. His hands trembled slightly as he laid the cassette tape and photographs out on the scarred wooden table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. At last, Rebecca sat down, slotting the cassette into an old deck Thomas had dug out from the attic. A faint hiss filled the room, then silence, before a man's voice emerged, low, patient, chilling. "Beth, come closer to the mirror." "That's right. You know how, don't you?" A child's sob answered faintly, small and scared. "If you don't look, I'll turn off the light again." The sobbing faded, replaced by a heavy silence, then finally a soft, almost amused laugh. Rebecca pressed stop. The room seemed even quieter now, the slow tick of the clock on the wall the only sound. That voice, it was clear, wasn't Edward Graham. Thomas gently reached for one of the photographs Rebecca had brought. He turned it over in his hands, staring at the image of Emily sitting stiffly in a chair, her eyes blank, and behind her, faint in the reflection of a mirror, the tall silhouette of a man standing utterly still. His voice came out rough, almost hoarse. "I know who he was." He explained that the name Vernon Dreyfus had once appeared in the investigation records, a veteran Fresno police detective assigned to the Graham case back in 1971. When the trail went cold, it was Dreyfus who declared there were no further leads. But Thomas remembered seeing him come back to the house, late at night, for years afterward. He'd stay for hours, lights flickering inside long past midnight. No one dared ask questions. And when Dreyfus retired, the house was repossessed, left to rot. The files disappeared with the men who'd kept them. Rebecca sat motionless, each of Thomas's words sinking deeper into her. The one who'd taken those photographs, the one who'd kept the children in the crawlspace for years, was the same man responsible for investigating their disappearance. And if he'd been returning here in secret, it meant he'd been building this system even before the Grahams ever vanished. When Rebecca finally looked up, her eyes met Thomas's. He nodded slightly, confirming her unspoken thought. The Graham house, those mirrors, those walls, wasn't just where the family's lives ended. It was where one man staged his own private theater of horrors. On the way back, Rebecca pulled over for a moment, lowering her window to look toward the dark silhouette of Sycamore Street. The crumbling white facade of the house was swallowed in shadow, but the hallway mirror, faintly catching the moonlight through the front window, gleamed with a strange, cold glint. She could feel it. He was still out there, waiting. And she knew this time she would go back. The next night, Rebecca returned to Sycamore Street alone. She didn't call Thomas, not because she thought he wasn't needed, but because this time she needed to face it herself. The street was silent. The dim yellow glow of a few street lamps barely cut through the fog, leaving long stretches of darkness in between. She parked 2 blocks away, hiding her car in the shadows, and slipped on a fitted black jacket. In her bag she carried a flashlight, gloves, her phone already set to record, and a small portable drive. The rusty gate groaned as she pushed it open. The porch was still and quiet, the kitchen window slightly ajar as though it had been waiting all along. Rebecca ducked through, and once again the cold, heavy air closed in around her. She didn't stop at the hallway. Not at the mirror. Not at the crawlspace. This time she went straight to the garage door, the only part of the house she'd never touched. The wooden plank nailed across it looked newer, as though someone had recently sealed it. She jammed her pry bar under the edge, braced herself, and heaved. The board split with a sharp crack that echoed through the house. Behind it was pure darkness. The air that spilled out was cold as a freezer. Rebecca switched on her light and descended the stairs. The basement beneath the garage was larger than she'd imagined, maybe 30 square meters, with a low ceiling and stained concrete walls. Shelves lined the perimeter, stacked with boxes, albums, audio reels, and Polaroid film. In the center of the room sat a wooden chair under a single bare bulb. On the chair was a battered doll, its arms bound with coarse rope, its hair crudely cut, glassy eyes staring at the ceiling. Rebecca moved closer, her flashlight sweeping the room. In one corner, hidden behind a silver tarp, she found a small cabinet. She pulled the tarp aside. Inside was an old video camera mounted on a tripod, its indicator light blinking faintly red. Below it, a portable hard drive was plugged into a wall outlet, its green light blinking steadily. Rebecca crouched down. The indicator was on. He was still recording. A shiver ran through her. She turned, and in that instant, she saw it. In the darkest corner of the room, the edge of the shadow shifted ever so slightly, as though someone had been standing there, pressed against the wall, watching her the whole time. Her heart hammered, but she didn't run. She raised her light and swept it across the corner. The beam caught two deep-set eyes reflecting back at her. Then they were gone. She crouched, yanked the hard drive free, and shoved it into her bag. On her way back up the stairs, she could feel it behind her. That same chill clinging to the back of her neck. The faintest sound of footsteps followed her, soft and measured, from the bottom of the stairs. When she slipped back out through the kitchen window, she dared a quick glance back. The shadow was still there, halfway down the staircase. One hand rested on the banister. He didn't follow. He just waited. Back in her apartment, Rebecca triple-locked the door. She plugged the hard drive into her laptop and waited. A single folder appeared, labeled Observer. Inside were hundreds of videos, photos, scanned journals. Each file bore the name of a child, a woman, a family. And at the end, a folder created just 3 days earlier. Its name, Rebecca Scott. She opened it. Inside were photos of herself, on the street, in the cafe, outside her apartment. He'd been watching her from the moment she touched the camera. And now she understood. Tonight, she'd become part of his collection. The next morning, Rebecca woke while the sky was still gray with fog. Her apartment was eerily quiet, the faint glow from her laptop casting light on the screen, where the Observer folder still sat open. She had spent the entire night watching the files on the drive. Each video was another glimpse of horror. Children, women, each one forced to stare into a mirror, forced to smile, forced to play their part in the Polaroids. And at the end, there were videos of her, entering the house, crawling through the crawlspace, descending into the basement. He had been waiting for her. The final clip ended with her sleeping in her own apartment. Last night. Rebecca shut the laptop and drew in a deep breath. She understood now. He was still out there. And he wanted her to know it. At noon, she met Thomas in a quiet park. He already knew. His eyes were heavy when they met hers, pale and strained. He said, low and flat, that Vernon Dreyfus had died over 20 years ago. A sudden heart attack in his home. Case closed. But there were rumors. He hadn't worked alone. That he'd left someone behind. Thomas pressed a scrap of paper into her hand, scribbled with an address. An old warehouse on the edge of town, where he'd once hidden files no one had ever seen on record. Rebecca nodded. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid anymore. She knew she couldn't stop here. The warehouse stood alone in a desolate lot. Its steel door was flaking paint, the lock hanging loose. She pushed it open, faint daylight slipping through the roof slats. The air was thick with dust, old paper, and that strange, familiar metallic scent she'd smelled in the crawlspace. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with files. And in the center of the room sat an oval mirror in a black frame, identical to the one in the Graham House hallway. Rebecca approached it slowly, laying a hand against the glass. And from deep within the dark reflection, another hand pressed back from the other side. Light, cold, certain. She gasped and yanked her hand away. The mirror fogged over, revealing a gaunt face, sunken eyes, lips twisted into a crooked smile. The man stood behind the glass, watching her. She stumbled back, hand shaking as she fumbled for her phone, recording everything. And then he spoke. Not loud, not angry. Just a whisper. "You've seen me. Now, you belong to me." Rebecca turned and ran. The next day, news of a break-in at the warehouse appeared in a small local paper, noting that police had recovered dozens of boxes of records, tapes, and hundreds of Polaroids. No one mentioned the mirror. No one mentioned the shadow inside. 3 weeks later, Rebecca released her final podcast episode. The title, The Man Behind the Mirror. In it, she recounted everything. The Graham family, the mirror, the children forced to play their roles, and how he had documented it all, photo by photo, victim by victim. She ended with her voice quiet, steady. He's still out there, still watching. But now, we see him too. She paused for a few seconds before cutting the feed. The screen dimmed to black, leaving only the faint sound of breathing echoing from the mirror she'd placed in the corner of her room. And Rebecca never took her eyes off it.